I decided to climb Everest when two of my neighbors approached me, a couple who themselves have climbed Everest 15 times now, and were really interested in me going along with them on an expedition to do a series of stories on them. I never dreamed I'd be writing a book about that until things kind of turned towards the dark side of the mountain.
And how did things go wrong?
It started as soon as we got into Nepal with the political situation as the country fell apart. But the people that I'd gone to do stories on proved to be not quite so heroic as I thought. A lot of our equipment went missing, and I found some of it in my expedition mate's gear. Tents vanished. All 10 bottles of oxygen that my climbing partner and I were going to be depending on vanished while we were on the mountain. And eventually, although 4 of my teammates did make it to the summit of the mountain, the expedition climaxed with one of the expedition members beating his wife and leaving her unconscious outside a tent on the mountain.
Well, that's not the usual image we have of the noble undertaking of climbing Everest, conquering nature. Is this something that's recent, or has this always been kind of a dark underside?
I think there's always been a bit of a dark underside on Everest, but I think things have changed quite a bit in the last 10 years due to the amount of money spent on the mountain, particularly by neophyte mountaineers who really want to get to the top of the mountain. In 1996, John Krakauer wrote about these commercial expeditions that clients were paying $65,000 a piece to be a part of, and that has drawn a lot of less than savory elements to the mountain and created something of a mining town atmosphere there.
So there really, it's generated by cash, by greed.
I think it's generated by greed, and I think it's generated by lust for glory that a lot of people have in the outdoors. There's always the question of whether people are driven to sociopathic behavior when they're on the mountain, or whether sociopaths look for a place to go where they can behave the way they want. I think one of the biggest reasons that I wrote this book was that people will go to great lengths to prepare themselves to do something like climb Mount Everest or, say, ski to the South Pole or the North Pole, and they'll be incredibly fit and they'll be great athletes, but they won't prepare themselves at all for the social or cultural challenges that they might face. Very few of these clients that arrive on Mount Everest aren't shocked to learn that there's actually crime on the mountain, and they're not really prepared to deal with that. So I think the biggest solution is for people to be realistic and educate themselves about what they're going off to do rather than just prepare their body. They need to prepare themselves mentally and learn about what they're going to be involved in. The doctor in Washington, D.C., his name is Neil Zontazana, and to some degree myself, we were both unprepared for the social challenges that we were dealing with on the mountain, even though we were both very fit and had trained quite hard to be prepared to get to the summit of the mountain.
So some of those situations you said are criminal. There's crime at base camp. What kind of crime? You mentioned someone stealing some of your oxygen, but what other kinds of...
Well, you kind of get, particularly on the Tibetan side, you got a fairly fast education in that in the last few years on the mountain. In my case, I arrived at base camp, which really does look like a mining town, to find more than 80 tents set up by Chinese and Tibetan merchants that had just arrived on the mountain to sell things to Westerners. And in this mining town that sits up at the base of Mount Everest, there are brothels, and we were routinely propositioned by prostitutes or gentlemen who were representing prostitutes on the mountain. There's a certain amount of drug use and smuggling going on. I've seen ropes cut on the climbing route to prevent people from getting up the mountain. Tents have been stolen, and many climbers that I've spoken with have talked of arriving at their camps, even the highest camps on the mountain, to unzip the door in their tent and find somebody in their sleeping bag, eating their food, burning their fuel from their cylinders.
And do you have plans to go back?
Never say never, but there are thousands of mountains in the world that are more interesting and more beautiful to me. I think one of the interesting tragedies of Mount Everest, and one that a number of very experienced mountaineers and very accomplished mountaineers mentioned to me is that on Everest every year you can find dozens of climbers with limited backgrounds and very limited climbing resumes who've gotten a substantial amount of corporate sponsorship to go and climb Mount Everest. But in that same area, in Nepal, there are literally hundreds of mountains that have never been climbed, have never had a human foot on them. And if these very experienced mountaineers were to go to those same corporate sponsors and try to get some support to go and do true off-the-map exploratory mountaineering, nobody would be interested, because the reality is you really can only get support for things that are as sexy as Everest or as covered in the media as Mount Everest is.
So what's next?